Hi guys, it's Katie and I have another food prep video for you. This time I made some things for the freezer and some things I just prepped ahead for the week. This time I prepped and washed some veggies, including a big bag of diced onions for the freezer. I got a good deal on onions at Aldi, so I made these to use in recipes, and I also made some caramelized onions. I made some roasted garbanzo beans, just a nice salty crunchy snack. And I made some bone broth. Then with some of the bone broth and some of the caramelized onions, I made some French onion soup for the freezer. I'm going to start with the bone broth because it does take the longest. And if you've never made bone broth before, I highly recommend it. If you've ever made homemade chicken stock, then you know how much better it is than store-bought chicken stock. But this bone broth is even 10 times better than that. I get these beef bones at the International Supermarket just because they're a better price, but I've seen them even at the more conventional grocery stores as well. Sometimes they're called beef leg bones or beef feet. And some people will roast the bones or add some vinegar to help leach out some of the minerals. I don't do any of that. I just throw them into the slow cooker, and I'm going to cover them with water, putting about 3 quarts of water in. And I'm going to let these cook for 24 hours. So I'm just going to cover them with the water. I'm not adding any seasoning or anything. I'll add the seasoning as I use it. And I'm going to cook them for 24 hours. So my crock pot has this timer. I have to come back every 10 hours and restart it. And this is what it looks like the next day. So this is day 2 after they've cooked for 24 hours. And yes, my crock pot lid is missing its handle. But I'm just going to turn off the crock pot and take the lid off and give it a chance to cool down a little bit. So I'm just going to strain the broth into another container. And if you wanted to lay a piece of cheesecloth into the strainer, you'd get a nice clear broth, but I don't usually bother with that. And you can see how deep and rich the color is. It's really delicious stuff. And there's a good amount of fat, which we can remove later. To the bones, I'm just going to add more water, just cover them again, and let them cook for another 24 hours. And you could do 2, 3, 4 batches with the same bones, but each subsequent batch will be significantly lighter than the batch before. So with the first batch that I made, I'm going to put it in these plastic containers, but I'm only going to fill them up halfway, and I'll show you why in just a minute. But I'm just going to put some lids on these and store them in the refrigerator while batch number 2 is cooking. And what you see left over in the container, that's what I'm going to use to make my onion soup. So after the second batch has cooked 24 hours, this is now day 3, I'm straining it, and you can see it's much lighter and it's much less volume. And I could do, like I said, a 3rd, 4th batch, but after about 2 days of the crock pot on my counter, I'm done with it, and the next batch would be too light to really use for much more than just boiling rice in any way. So these are the containers that I filled yesterday, and I'm just going to remove the fat. It's nice and solid now, so it's easy to remove. And you can see underneath is that jiggly, gelatinous broth. That's the good stuff. So I'm going to remove the fat from both containers and then top them off with the second batch. So by doing half and half, that way I get 2 containers that are the same instead of 1 container of a strong, first run and then a second container of the second run. I have 2 containers that are pretty similar now. And there's a little bit left in the container there that I will use that for the onion soup as well. For the roasted chickpeas, I have 2 cups of dried chickpeas that I soaked for about 18 hours. And you could use canned chickpeas too, but since they're already cooked, you would just need to adjust your roasting time. I'm going to add some olive oil and salt and give them a toss. And if you're using canned chickpeas, just use an appropriate amount of salt since the canned ones would already have some salt. And then I ended up putting some smoked paprika, but I didn't really taste it in the finished product, so I think I'll just leave that off from now on. Just give them a stir and then spread them out onto a cookie sheet. I have mine here on a Silpat. I don't think that's really necessary. And I'm just going to spread them out in a single layer so they roast nice and evenly. And then I'm going to put them in a 350-degree oven for about 55 to 65 minutes. And like I said, if you're using canned, you would want to cut that down. Probably start checking at about 30 minutes. And a few times while they're roasting, you want to go ahead and give them a stir, toss them around a little bit just so that they roast evenly. And be careful because sometimes they'll pop, and when you open the oven door, they might shoot out at you. After about an hour and 10 minutes, I just turned off my oven, cracked the door, and just let them cool in the oven. While the oven was hot, I went ahead and dried some bread. So I have just a few pieces from an old loaf, and I'm breaking up into these little pieces. I'll use these to make homemade stuffing, or I can put them in the food processor and grind them up into breadcrumbs. If I didn't have my oven on anyway, I probably would just cover this with a tea towel and leave it on the counter overnight. But since the oven's hot anyway, I'm just going to put them in the bottom shelf there. And I actually just ended up closing this up and leaving them overnight so that they were fully cooled before I packed them up. So here they are the next day. I just took them out and they're nice and cool. And the chickpeas just went into a mason jar. And the bread pieces went into this peanut butter jar. I already had a few. And usually once this gets filled, it's just about enough to make a batch of homemade stuffing. So I just like to have those on hand. As far as veggie prep, I'm just going to wash my lettuce. So I just take it apart and soak it in a sink full of cold water. And this is store-bought lettuce, so I usually just rinse it once. If it's homegrown, I usually have to rinse it 2 or 3 times. But I'm just going to let it sit in this cold water for about 5 minutes. And then I will spin it dry with my salad spinner. I got this salad spinner at a White Elephant sale for 10 cents. Probably the best 10 cents I've ever spent on a kitchen gadget. And then I'm going to put these lettuce leaves whole in a plastic container with a dry napkin in the bottom. Just keep my lettuce whole because it keeps it from browning, and it also that way I can use it for salads or on sandwiches or something like that. I did a video a while back on trying to keep lettuce fresher longer by vacuum sealing it, and I'll link that down below if you're interested. But that's not something that I do regularly, especially with just one head of lettuce. I'll go through this in just a few days. So I just keep it in that plastic container and just put it in the fridge. I'm going to do the same thing to some cilantro. Now, I always have bad luck with cilantro. If I leave it in the bag, it will go bad in a day or 2. So I'm just going to do the same thing, wash it so it's ready to go, and then spin it dry so it lasts longer. And then it will also go into a plastic container with a dry napkin in the bottom. And that just absorbs any extra water to keep it fresh. So the last of my salad vegetables are my radishes here. I just take off the green tops just because they'll go bad in just a day or 2 and they'll make your radishes go bad. And mine were kind of sandy, so I'm just rinsing them off. I don't trim them or anything just because the cut ends will just dry out anyway, so I just trim them as I use them. And these also will go into a plastic container with a cloth. That'll absorb the moisture, but it also keeps them dark to keep them from sprouting. For the onions, I got these at Aldi for 79 cents for a 3-pound bag, so it's a pretty good deal. I bought 5 bags of them, and 2 bags I'm just going to hold back and use fresh, and then 3 bags I'm going to process here. So I'm just going to peel them all up, and once I have them all peeled, I had a nice sink full of onion skins, and you could save these, keep them in your freezer, and use them to make veggie stock. Unfortunately, I don't have the freezer space for that, so mine just went into the compost. And then with 1 bag of the onions, I just chop them up and storing them in a Ziploc bag. And I'm going to put these in the freezer. And once they're in the freezer, I'm going to take them out a couple times while they're freezing and just toss them around like this. That way they don't freeze into one giant block. I can actually take out as I need, just a few here and there. With the other 2 bags of onions, I'm just going to slice them up into these half moons. I like to cut the onion in half and then slice them. It makes it easier to slice, but also makes them easier to eat so you don't have these super long strands of onion. Then I'm going to put all those sliced onions into my big stock pot. And if you're doing a smaller batch, then you want to use a wide, shallow pan. But since I'm doing this many onions, I'm using my stock pot. I'm going to give that a good tablespoon or so of salt and probably about a 1/4 cup of olive oil. This is quite a bit of onions. And then I'm going to toss those around that way to distribute the salt, but also to kind of break those slices up into individual little rings of onions so that they cook more evenly. I'm going to cook these on a high, medium-high heat because as they sweat down, you want that moisture to evaporate. You don't want these to sit in puddles of their own moisture and boil away. You want them to fry. So keep that temperature up and just stir them occasionally. and they'll sweat down. This is about 30 minutes in, and they're about half the volume that I started with. And then after about 45 minutes in, they're about the quarter of the volume that I started with. And now they're starting to brown and stick to the pan. And I'm just going to go ahead and stir all of that brown fond, stir it up and mix it back into the onions. And you don't want to turn the heat down, you still want to keep it up and just continuously stir that brown bits back up into the onions. And you're going to have to babysit it. You can't leave it for more than 30 or 45 seconds because just about the time you scrape up all that brown bits, a new layer is going to form. So just continuously stir and cook them, and it's going to take about an hour altogether, which is why I really like to do these in big batches and have them in the freezer. And make sure that when you're done, you get all of the goodness off of your spoon, so you can see that goodness there. Just stir that back into the onions, and like I said, this batch took about an hour. That's the color that I like them. You can pretty much stop at any point that you want, but I like nice, deep, rich color on them. Then just turn them off and let them cool. And from this giant stock pot full of onions, that was 6 pounds of onions, I ended up with about 3 cups of caramelized onions. And I usually just put these in little half-cup portions in plastic containers and freeze them, but I have this silicone mold, so I thought I'd give it a try. These have a lot of flavor, so a little bit goes a long way. I usually only put maybe 1 or 2 tablespoons on top of a hamburger or on top of a steak, so these little compartments will be nice to have little individual servings. And I'm going to use about half of the caramelized onion, so about 1.5 cups I'm freezing in these little cubes. And I just froze them for about 8 hours, and then they pop out in these nice little individual servings, so I might use this silicone mold more often. I'm just going to pop those out, put them in a plastic container, and put them back in the freezer. With the second half of the caramelized onions, that's about 1.5 cups of caramelized onions, I'm going to add 1 quart of that bone broth, and then just give that a stir to break up all those caramelized onions, dissolve them in the broth. Then I'm going to add about 3, 4, 5 dashes of Worcestershire sauce. That's just to taste. And you can also add thyme. Thyme is really good in this soup. I just don't have any. And just stir that around, and then I'm going to bring it up to temperature just to taste it for seasoning. You want to make sure you're tasting for seasoning when the food is at the temperature you're going to serve it at. So just brought it up to temperature, adjusted the salt and the Worcestershire sauce, and then I cooled it down, packed it into those plastic containers, and labeled it and got it ready for the freezer. So that is my food prep video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give the video a thumbs up. I think I might do these videos more regularly. I don't do this sort of thing every week, so it probably won't be every week, but when I do, I would be happy to share with you. So if you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe. Leave me some comments if you want. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much for watching.